He said it the way someone says, "Good morning," casual. Like the words didn't carry any weight at all. My son-in-law sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the one my late husband Gerald had built from reclaimed pine the summer before our youngest was born, and he folded his hands together and said, "Margaret, we really need to talk about what happens to the shop when you're gone." I was 67 years old. I was not dying. I picked up my tea and said nothing. That was the first time. It would not be the last. My name is Margaret Calloway. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the second of 4 children, and I learned early that the quietest person in the room is often the one paying the most attention. My father was a miner. My mother worked the checkout at the grocery on Lorne Street until her knees gave out. Neither of them had much, but what they had they held onto with both hands, and they taught me to do the same. I did not grow up believing the world owed me anything. I grew up believing you built what you needed, and you protected it, and you did not let anyone take it from you with a smile on their face. I built Calloway's Home and Garden on a quarter-acre lot in Barrie 31 years ago. What started as a small garden center with $60 herb kits and a second-hand cash register became something I am genuinely proud of. 3 greenhouses, seasonal staff of 12, a loyal customer base that had followed me through 2 recessions, a flood, and a pandemic. Gerald handled the books until his heart gave out 4 years ago, and after that I handled everything. I did not crumble. I learned QuickBooks. I hired a part-time bookkeeper named Frances who came in on Tuesdays, and I kept going because that is what you do. My daughter Claire is 41. She has Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness, and for most of her life, that was a combination I admired. She studied design at Ryerson, moved to Calgary for a few years, came back to Ontario when she met a man named Derek at a friend's wedding in Collingwood. Derek Howell. Broad-shouldered. Good handshake. The kind of man who always laughs at his own jokes a half-second before anyone else does. I told myself the unease I felt was just the ordinary grief of watching your child choose someone who wasn't family yet. I told myself I would warm to him. I tried. They married in September, 3 years after Gerald passed. Claire wore a dress we picked out together at a boutique in Newmarket, ivory with small buttons down the back, and when she walked toward Derek at the front of that hall, I cried the way I imagine every mother cries for what she was gaining, and quietly, privately, for what I already sensed was beginning to shift. They moved in with me 8 months after the wedding. Claire told me it made sense the housing market in Barrie was unmanageable. They were saving for a down payment, and she missed being close to the shop. I believed the first part and the last part. I am less certain now about the middle. At first, things were manageable. Claire helped at Calloway's on weekends, the way she had as a teenager. Derek worked remotely for a project management firm in Toronto, and he kept to himself mostly. He had coffee. He answered emails. He went for long runs along Kempenfelt Bay and came back looking like he was calculating something. The small things started in the winter. Nothing dramatic, just small things. He rearranged my kitchen cupboards while I was at the shop one Saturday and told me it was more efficient. He asked Frances, my bookkeeper, how long she had been with me and whether she was planning to retire soon. He started joining conversations about the shop that he hadn't been invited to, just pulling out the chair, sitting down, asking questions that sounded like interest but felt like inventory. One evening, Claire and I were talking about the spring planting schedule, and Derek sat down and said, "Have you ever thought about franchising?" I said I hadn't. He said, "You should. There's a lot of untapped value sitting in that brand." I said, "It's not a brand. It's a garden center." He smiled. He did that thing where he tilted his head slightly, like I had said something charming but not quite accurate. "Margaret," he said, "everything is a brand." I did not sleep well that night. The conversation at my pine table came about 3 weeks later. The one about what happens to the shop when I'm gone. I had let it go, filed it away, under the category of things said by people who think ahead to their own benefit while calling it concern for you. I had a lifetime of practice identifying that category, but Derek was patient in a way that made my skin prickle. He began mentioning taxes. He mentioned this at dinner. In the car, once standing in the doorway of the second greenhouse where I was tending to the primroses, he said there were significant probate issues with small business succession in Ontario. He said a trust structure or an early transfer of ownership could protect the asset from the government taking a large portion. He said he had been reading about it. He said he only wanted to help. Every time he said it, Claire was nearby. And every time he said it, Claire would look at me with something in her eyes that was part agreement, part apology, part something I hadn't seen on her face before. Something that looked uncomfortably like pressure. In February, he asked me directly. We were sitting after dinner, the three of us, and he said, "Margaret, we'd really like you to consider signing the shop over to Claire now, as a gift. It eliminates the estate complications, and you could stay involved as long as you want." Claire reached over and touched my hand. "Mom, Derek's been looking into it. It really does make financial sense." I looked at my daughter's hand on mine. I thought about Gerald, who had spent 30 years watching me build something from dirt and seeds and stubbornness, who had sat in that same chair and said, "The week before he died, Margaret, don't let anyone make you small. Promise me." I thought about what Derek had done with that framing, eliminate estate complications, as a gift, stay involved, as long as you want, how each piece of it sounded generous and logical until you held them together and saw the shape they made. I said, "I'll think about it." I did not tell them that thinking about it had, in fact, already begun, just not in the direction they imagined. The next morning I called a man named Paul Desjardins. Paul had been Gerald's lawyer and had become mine by default, and over the last 4 years had become something closer to an advisor. I explained what had been happening. I explained the ask. Paul listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Margaret, I think we should meet." I drove to his office in Barrie on a Thursday when Claire thought I was at a plant supplier in Innisfil. I did not lie. I just did not mention where else I was going. Paul and I spent 2 hours reviewing the current structure of the business. He walked me through what an early transfer would actually mean legally and financially. He explained, carefully and plainly, what I would be giving up. He explained what I would be keeping. He told me about a mechanism Gerald had actually put in place 4 years earlier, a provision in the family trust document that meant any transfer of Calloway's home and garden required unanimous trustee approval, and the trustees were myself, Paul, and my sister Ruth, in Winnipeg. Gerald had done this quietly, without making a production of it. He had not told me in detail because he trusted me to handle my own affairs, but he had built a wall around what we made together, and he had not told the wall to announce itself. I sat in Paul's office, and I felt something settle in my chest. I said, "So if I sign nothing, nothing changes." Paul said, "Correct. And if someone pressures you into signing something without proper trustee process, it would be invalid anyway." I drove back to Barrie in the snow, with the heater going, and something very close to calm moving through me. I had not yet decided what to do with what I knew, but I knew it, and that was enough for now. Through March, Derek escalated in the way that people do when they believe they are close to something. He sent me articles about business succession planning. He forwarded me a podcast episode about family legacy and estate taxes. He mentioned, more than once, a friend of his who was a business lawyer in Toronto. Not Paul's caliber, not Paul's integrity, Just a name offered in a way that was meant to make me feel that my own lawyer was perhaps not the most current option. One night, Claire came to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, the way she used to as a child when something was wrong. She said, "Mom, I just want to make sure you're taken care of. That's all Derek wants, too. He's actually really good with this kind of thing." I looked at my daughter. I thought about all the versions of her I had loved, the one who brought earthworms inside in her pockets, the one who called me from Calgary at 2 in the morning after a bad breakup, the one who stood in an ivory dress and cried before she even reached the altar. I thought about how love can be real and still be used as a lever by someone standing just outside the frame. I said, "I know you love me, sweetheart." She said, "Then why won't you talk to us about this?" I said, "I am talking to you. Right now." She went to bed frustrated. I sat up for a while looking at the framed photo on my nightstand, Gerald and me at the shop's grand opening, 1993, both of us squinting into the sun, standing in front of a hand-painted sign that read Callaway's Home and Garden in my mother's handwriting. I thought about how far that was from a brand. In April, Derek found out about my meeting with Paul. I don't know how. Perhaps Claire had mentioned the Innisfil story and something didn't add up. Perhaps he had been paying more attention than I gave him credit for. He came to find me in the first greenhouse on a Saturday afternoon, and the way he came in, not asking, just walking through the door I had not invited him through, told me that whatever patients he had been performing was running low. He said, "I hear you talked to your lawyer." I was repotting a flat of tomato seedlings, and I did not stop. "I did," I said, without mentioning it to us. I set down the small pot in my hand and looked at him. "Derek," I said, "this is my business. Paul has been my lawyer for 15 years. Consulting him about legal matters is not something I need to clear with anyone." He looked at me for a long moment. The charm was gone. What was underneath it was not angry exactly. It was calculated, the way a person looks when they are deciding how much of their actual position to reveal. He said, "Claire is going to inherit this shop someday. She deserves to have input into how it's structured." I said, "When that day comes, she will. That day is not today." He said, "Margaret, you're not being reasonable." I said, "I'm being precise. There's a difference." He left. I finished repotting the tomatoes. My hands were steady. My hands are always steady when I am certain. Things became harder after that. Derek was cooler to me at home, which was actually a relief. But he worked on Claire. I watched it happen across April and into May, a slow, patient erosion. He would say things in front of me that were technically supportive and functionally undermining. He would tell Claire about businesses he had read about that hadn't planned ahead and what happened to the families afterward. He would ask her, with me present, whether she felt included in the future of the shop. He made my refusal to sign over my life's work into a story about Claire being excluded. He was very good at it. There was a Saturday in early May that I will not forget. I came home from Callaway's at 5:30 and found Claire in the kitchen, quiet in the way that follows a long conversation. Derek was on the back deck. Claire looked up at me, and her eyes were red. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I set down my bag. I sat across from her. I said, "Tell me what you think I'm doing." She said, "Derek says you've never really trusted me with the shop. He says this is your way of keeping control. He says you're going to let the government take most of it in taxes just to prove a point." I listened to every word. I heard Gerald's voice underneath hers and Derek's framing on top of it, and my own love for her running through the middle of it like water through rock. I said, "Claire, your father built a trust before he died. Did you know that?" She shook her head. I said, "He did. Because he was careful. because he thought about the future in a way that wasn't about taxes or control. He thought about it in terms of what protects this family. What he built means that any transfer of the shop requires approval from 3 people, including your Aunt Ruth. Not just me. She stared at me. Why didn't you tell us? Because it wasn't relevant until someone made it relevant, I said. She was quiet for a long time. I watched something move across her face. Confusion at first, then something more painful, the particular pain of a person beginning to question the story they have been told. She said, Derek said Paul was old-fashioned and probably hadn't looked at the trust in years. I said, Paul and I reviewed it in March. She said nothing. I said, I am not keeping you from anything. I am keeping this shop which your father and I built together, which I have run alone for 4 years, which employs 12 people who depend on it from being transferred under circumstances that don't add up. When I die, or when I choose to retire, you will inherit what is yours. I have never once suggested otherwise. I got up and put the kettle on. I made 2 cups of tea. I set one in front of Claire and sat back down. She said quietly, What does Derek want with the shop? I said, I don't know exactly, but I think we should find out. I had hired a bookkeeper in February. Not Francis. Francis was still with me on Tuesdays. This was a second set of eyes, a retired forensic accountant named Henry, who had done work for Paul's firm and who came in on Thursdays under the title Operational Consultant. I had not announced this. I had not hidden it. I had simply done it the way I do most things. Henry had found something in the first 2 weeks of April. He found that Derek, using Claire's laptop and her login to the business management software she had access to as a weekend helper, had downloaded 3 years of financial records from Callaway's. He had also accessed our supplier contracts, our lease terms, and our insurance documentation. None of this was illegal under the current access permissions, but it was not the behavior of a man who was interested in tax efficiency. Henry also found something else. Through routine financial research, the kind Paul's firm performed as a matter of due diligence, once I explained the situation, it was discovered that Derek had been named in a civil lawsuit in Alberta 3 years prior. A business partner had accused him of diverting funds from a shared investment. The case had been settled out of court. The terms were confidential. Derek had never mentioned any of this to Claire or to me. Paul felt I should speak to Claire before doing anything else. I agreed. I chose a Tuesday evening in June. Derek was at a work conference in Ottawa 2 nights away. Claire and I sat at the pine table with the windows open and the smell of the garden coming in, and I told her everything I knew. I showed her what Henry had found about the file downloads. I told her about the Alberta lawsuit. I did not editorialize. I did not say what I thought it meant. I laid it down in front of her the way you lay down evidence, and I let her look at it. Claire sat very still for a long time. Then she said, How long have you known? I said, Henry found the downloads in April. Paul found the lawsuit in May. I have been waiting for the right moment. She said, You were protecting me. I said, I was making sure I had the full picture before I said anything. That's different from protecting you. You're 41 years old. You don't need protection. You needed information. She started to cry, not the helpless kind, the other kind, the kind that comes when something you suspected, but refused to believe, finally has enough weight to be real. I did not rush to comfort her. I gave her the space to feel it. That is something I learned late, that sitting with someone in pain is not the same as abandoning them to it. After a while, she said, What do I do? I said, That's entirely up to you, but if you want Paul's number, I'll give it to you. She took the number. I will not tell you the details of what came next, because those details belong to Claire. I will tell you that Derek came back from Ottawa, and that the conversation that followed lasted several days, and that Claire asked him to leave our home on a Thursday morning with 2 suitcases and the set of keys I had given him. Set that no longer worked because I had quietly had the locks rekeyed the week prior. He did not go quietly. He called the process unfair. He said I had poisoned Claire against him. He said I was a controlling old woman who had never given him a chance. He said a number of things in the driveway that my neighbor Bruce almost certainly heard from behind his hedge, and I stood on the porch with my tea, and I let him say them, and when he was finished I said, "Goodbye, Derek. Drive safe." He drove away. I went inside and called Ruth. My sister is 63, and she lives in Winnipeg, and she has never once failed to make me laugh when I needed it. When I told her the whole story, the succession talk, the file downloads, the Alberta lawsuit, the rekeyed locks, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Margaret, Dad would be insufferable about how right he was to leave that trust to you and Paul." I laughed for the first time in months. Real laughter, the kind that starts in your chest. The summer was not simple. Claire was living with the ordinary devastation of a marriage dissolving, and the less ordinary devastation of discovering that someone had been using her as access. She cried. She was angry. She went through the predictable stages of wondering if she had missed signs, if she could have seen it sooner, if any of it had been real. I did not offer easy answers. I brought her tea. I took her to the shop on slow afternoons and let her work in the greenhouse the way she used to, potting things, the physical rhythm of it. I have always believed that soil has something clarifying in it, that putting your hands in dirt and doing small, patient work is one of the better ways to find your footing when the ground has shifted. In August, Paul helped Claire initiate a review of the access Derek had taken of the shop's financial records in conjunction with what was now her own legal counsel. It was determined that while no money had been taken, the documents he had accessed were likely intended to support a valuation of the business, possibly in preparation for a private sale proposition or a financing arrangement that would have required the shop as collateral. The specifics remain with the lawyers. What I can say is that Gerald's trust was not merely about taxes. It was a lock on a door Derek had been quietly measuring for a key. By September, Claire had begun the process of separation. She had also, quietly and on her own initiative, enrolled in an evening course on small business management at Georgian College. She came to me one Sunday morning and said she wanted to understand the shop properly, not just help on weekends, but actually learn how it worked, how the books ran, how you negotiated with suppliers and managed seasonal staff, and made the 100 small decisions that add up to a business staying alive. I said, "I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask me that." She looked at me with Gerald's eyes. "We started Monday. I want to say something to you, because I think some of you know exactly what I am talking about when I describe watching someone smile across your kitchen table and realize that the smile is a tool. I think some of you know what it feels like to be called unreasonable when you are simply being careful. I think some of you have been in a room where your own love for someone, your child, your family was being held up like a mirror to make you feel that protecting yourself was the same as failing them. It is not. I did not fight Derek. I did not make speeches. I did not throw him out in January when I first felt the unease, or in February when he sat at my table and talked about my death like a line item. I waited because I wanted to be sure. I wanted to know what I was dealing with before I dealt with it. That is not weakness. That is the difference between swinging at shadows and knowing exactly what you are aiming at. Gerald built something into our family's paperwork that I didn't fully appreciate until I needed it. He was quiet about it because he trusted me. He didn't make a ceremony of his foresight. He just did the thing and let it sit there. Solid, the way he built that pine table not to be admired but to be used. I think about that a lot. The things we build in quiet, without announcement. The ones that hold. Callaway's Home and Garden opened for its 32nd season in April. Claire came to the opening morning staff meeting for the first time in an official capacity, not as my daughter helping out, but as the person learning to run it someday. Frances brought a coffee cake, and my head greenhouse manager, a steady young woman named Deepa, who has been with me for 6 years, shook Claire's hand like she meant it. I stood at the edge of the room and watched the people I have spent 32 years building something with, and I thought, this is what you protect, not because it is worth money, because it is worth time, because it is made of mornings and decisions, and the accumulated faith of people who showed up. I am 67 years old. I am not dying. I am paying attention. And I will tell you right now that is more than enough.